All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Looks like it's noon. I hope everyone could hear me. If you can't, just type something over to the side and let me know. But just a brief introduction of myself. My name is Aleasha Boling, and I'm an attorney at ParrRichey in Indianapolis. I represent some utilities, generally some energy utilities and telecom utilities, but more specifically, I represent rural telecom utilities here in Indiana, and that would include some of them are cooperatives and some of them are actually for-profit entities as well. And I'm going to talk about a topic today that I hope is pretty timely. And I'm going to focus, when I talk a little bit about the background of what's been going on, I'm going to focus on Indiana initially only because I am a lawyer in Indiana and I do not hold myself out to be an expert in the law of any other state, but I will definitely touch on some other things that are going on in some Midwest states as well, because I know that this conference is for people from all over. So I guess I want to start with just a little bit of background of what I'm going to talk about today, and that is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Indiana and other states have put in place disconnect moratoria, basically where utilities, in many cases, including telecom and broadband providers, were not permitted to disconnect customers for a certain period of time or during the length of the pandemic. Now in Indiana and in other Midwest states, they are allowed to disconnect customers. So that moratorium, at least in Indiana, has expired. And so now companies are dealing with, well, what do we do to try to now collect on these customer accounts that might be very delinquent because people have been unable to pay their bills. They've had financial hardships resulting from COVID. And what do we do to try to get their accounts up to date? And there are some requirements from different states on what they have to do, what utilities have to do. And then there are also just some sort of best practices and some examples of what some telecom utilities are doing that I'm going to talk about. So just for a little bit of background. So in Indiana, it really all kind of started in March with executive orders. The governor on March 19th deemed gas, electric, broadband, telecommunications, water, and wastewater services as essential and prohibited providers of these services from discontinuing service to any customer in the state during the length of the public health emergency. Now, as I'll talk about in a minute, that disconnect moratorium has actually expired in Indiana, but the public health emergency continues. So notably, this first order, while it says broadband and telecommunication are considered essential services, which certainly they are, by a practical standpoint, it didn't define broadband or telecommunications in any specific way. In Indiana, we have different definitions for what is a public utility or what is a communication service provider, and those are definitions that are provided by statute, but this executive order didn't use any of those definitions. It just kind of broadly said broadband and telecommunications services, and anyone providing those services cannot cut off customers during this time. Notably, this order also did not require that providers cease charging their normal rates and charges for services during this time. So it allowed customer accounts to, or customers to continue receiving services without being disconnected, but which allowed them to kind of continue to accrue unpaid charges, and their accounts go more and more delinquent if they were not paying on them. The next action regarding utilities doesn't have a lot to do with customer accounts, but that was March 23rd, which was Indiana governor's stay-at-home order, which basically included internet, video, and telecommunications systems in the governor's definition of essential infrastructure. So we all know how essential those are. So that was included in the governor's order. And then in May 21st is really the first time in Indiana when we started to see some consideration of what would happen after the disconnect moratorium expired. That executive order extended that moratorium until June 30th and set a final expiration date of June 30th, which ultimately ended up being extended. But it also said that utility companies and municipalities were encouraged to continue service and work with customers to establish reasonable payment plans for past due accounts. So that's really the first time that we saw some discussion of payment plans for telecom customers. And then on June 30th was the final governor's executive order that really had to do with this topic, and it extended the disconnect moratorium in Indiana for utilities that are not regulated by the IURC, by the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, extended the moratorium until August 14th. For utilities that are regulated by the IURC, there was a separate order that I'll talk about in a minute that came out from the IURC that extended that moratorium for those utilities until August 14th as well. And the difference really for telecom utilities is in some manner in Indiana, they are regulated by the IURC with respect to certain aspects of their operation. If they provide basic phone service, they are considered a public utility in Indiana. And so to that extent, they might be somewhat more regulated by the IURC than a telecom provider that is like broadband only. But they are generally, for the most part, not rate regulated by the IURC, other than a few certain types of services that a telecom provider might provide that where they might have to file a tariff with the IURC. So there's that distinction there. The governor was still regulating whether non-jurisdictional utilities could disconnect customers at that point, and then the IURC started regulating whether jurisdictional utilities could disconnect customers. That June 30th executive order also introduced the concept of payment plans that were at least 6 months long for the repayment of customer accounts. It strongly encouraged utilities to offer payment plans of at least 6 months and to set those up with customers as soon as possible, knowing that the disconnect moratorium would expire soon. The other kind of path that Indiana has taken to kind of deal with this issue has been through the IURC, as I mentioned, over jurisdictional utilities. There were a couple of different petitions that were filed at the IURC. One of them was filed by some gas and electric utilities that were really trying to seek relief related to the impact of COVID-19, but that case was ultimately consolidated into a different case where the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor in Indiana filed a petition with the IURC requesting that it investigate all jurisdictional utilities to consider the impact of COVID-19 on utility service, and also it was seeking certain ratepayer protections under that petition by the OUCC. So any orders, as I mentioned, that come out of this case with the IURC directly pertain to jurisdictional utilities. It appears in this sense that these orders are talking about what would be included under the definition in Indiana of public utilities. And as I mentioned, right now that definition includes telecom utilities that would be providing voice service, basically telephone service, but does not right now include telecom utilities that would be providing only broadband. And so there may be some differences in which telecom utilities that the IURC orders in Indiana might actually affect. The orders, although they can only regulate jurisdictional utilities, they do throughout definitely still encourage non-jurisdictional utilities to follow what is said in the order and the guidance in these orders. And so it's still instructive to look at them and be familiar with them, but they only directly apply to jurisdictional utilities that are regulated by the IURC. In that case, the IURC on June 29th issued an order. It found that while customers were experiencing financial strain due to COVID, utilities were also experiencing an increase in expenses related to COVID. I'm sure that most of you know that to probably be true. That order prohibited disconnection, as I mentioned before, through August 14th and applied to all customer classes. That order also required any filed tariffs for rates and charges with the IURC to be amended to exclude late fees, convenience fees, deposits, and reconnect fees, and required utilities to kind of clearly communicate this to their customers via their website or their normal customer communications. It also required flexible and extended payment arrangements for customers in arrears of a minimum of 6 months. It encouraged utilities to work to engage customers as soon as possible, as I mentioned, and also mentioned some additional arrangements that utilities might consider making to help their customers, including using their deposits to pay existing arrearages, no limit on the number of payment arrangements that the utility might be able to offer, requiring smaller payments with those payment arrangements and that kind of thing. Then on August 12th, the Commission issued so far is its final order, or its most recent order, I should say, in this case, after collecting some information from different utilities on how COVID was really impacting them, how their customers were, or whether their customers had been able to pay their past due balances and that kind of thing. In that order, the Commission found that there was actually more effort needed on the part of utilities to enroll customers with outstanding balances in their repayment plans. Importantly, it found that, which I suppose this is common sense, but when disconnection is prohibited, the usual inducement for customers to enter into a repayment plan is removed. So it was finding that customers and or customer accounts and the amount that were in that overall of unpaid charges were increasing because customers with the disconnect moratorium still in place were just not incentivized to enter into a repayment plan or to pay their unpaid bills. So based on that, the Commission at that time declined to extend the disconnect moratorium, allowed it to expire on August 14th. And so that was the date for jurisdictional utilities as well as non-jurisdictional utilities that expired. And that order also, however, expanded the prohibition on collecting late fees, deposits, and disconnect and reconnect fees for residential customers only until October 12th. It also extended the requirement to offer minimum 6-month repayment plans until October 12th. And as I mentioned before, the same was encouraged for non-jurisdictional utilities as well, like many broadband providers might be. Now, the OUCC did file a motion to extend these since it is now past October 12th. They filed a motion to extend these additional consumer protections about not collecting certain fees and things like that and offering the 6-month repayment plans. The parties are briefing that issue right now, and the IURC, as of this morning, had not made a decision on that yet. So technically, according to the previous order, those requirements expired on October 12th and have not been extended yet, but that is kind of still up in the air right now. So I want to talk a little bit about other states and what they have done. Like I mentioned, I am not a lawyer in those states, and so to the extent that someone in this group may have even better knowledge than I do about what is going on in these states, feel free to let me know or comment on the side. But I wanted to first mention that telecom utilities generally are regulated to a different degree in different states. And so when I talk about what other states have done with their utilities, as far as disconnections and payment plans and that kind of thing, consumer protections, it may in some cases apply more or less in a different state to telecom or broadband utilities, depending on the degree to which that particular kind of utility is regulated in that state. So, for example, in Ohio, there was a voluntary disconnect moratorium, but utilities were required to review their disconnect and reconnect policies at the beginning of the pandemic. The Public Utility Commission in Ohio also required utilities to offer extended repayment plans and expanded this to include non-residential customers as well as residential. And then some utilities, more likely probably energy utilities, in Ohio actually have decided to temporarily reduce or waive their collection of minimum demand charges, particularly for non-residential customers. So those are kind of some of the things that have been happening in that state. In Michigan, there was also a voluntary disconnect moratorium, but utilities were required to actually report their disconnections. The ones that they made. They're required to waive deposits and reconnect fees for certain qualifying customers that were affected by COVID, and they were also to extend access to flexible payment plans to their customers. Finally, I'll talk about Illinois, and that, there we go. Illinois actually had a mandatory disconnect moratorium like Indiana did, and it expired on July 26th. It has been voluntarily extended by several regulated utilities in Illinois, probably more likely, again, energy utilities, because the extension is through the winter months. And that is for eligible low-income residential customers and those who self-report that they're experiencing financial hardship due to COVID. Also in Illinois, utilities have been offering temporary, more flexible credit and collection procedures and waiving deposits for certain qualifying customers as well. So all of this is as a result of the financial impact, obviously, that the pandemic has had on customers and utilities both. I tried to find some good information kind of quantifying what the financial impact was on customers and the hardships they were facing on paying their telecom utility bills. And the best thing, kind of the most illustrative thing that I was able to find was actually a study from IU that they did in June. And it's talking about energy insecurity, but really some of the findings from the study would be equally as applicable to telecom utilities. That survey, it surveyed households that were at 200%, at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. It found that 25% of those people surveyed indicated negative job experiences as a result of COVID. So that could be job loss, or they could have been furloughed or had just their hours reduced. Nearly 29% of those households were not at that time paying their rent or mortgage in full, or they weren't paying it at all, or maybe they're making partial payments. Of course, this negatively affected not being able to pay your rent or your mortgage, for one thing, is going to also affect your ability to seek medical care, pay for medical care, feed your family, and then, of course, also pay your utility bills. And the study discussed how there was a greater inability to pay their energy bills, and that more and more were being disconnected because of it. But likely there would be a similar, if not worse, result for the payment of telecom bills, given that in many ways people might prioritize having electricity over having telecom services. Anecdotally, the households that were unable to pay were more likely to be at or below the poverty line. People of color, households with children under 5, or someone over 65, households with a person with a disability, and households, again, where someone had experienced some kind of negative job impact from COVID. So to kind of combat this, the states have taken the measures that I described before, and have required utilities, including broadband and telecom providers, to offer extended repayment plans for customers and different other consumer protections for customers. I did kind of a little survey of some Indiana rural telecom providers to sort of find out what it is that they were doing, how successful it had been, how they had been impacted by all of this. to kind of get an idea of, in the rural telecom world, what was really going on. So they all really pointed to customer communications as being very important to all of this, and to having successful results with getting customers back on track. Many of them kind of targeted the customers that really, were either very far behind in dollar amount on their bills, or were very had bills that were very long past due. They kind of targeted those customers and directly called them or emailed them. They sent regular reminders to those customers and really to all their customers, notifying them that the disconnect moratorium was expiring, and that the utility would be starting to do disconnects on August 14th when it expired, or some other date that was set by the utility. And they really made sure to follow up a lot with their customers, put the information on their website and all of that. And I think for most of them, that allowed them to have pretty good results with getting people, as I mentioned, back on track with their utility bills. As far as the actual repayment plans that have been offered, according to my very unscientific survey, generally they were maybe 6 to 12 months long. They were kind of targeted at any customers that may have arrears. Certainly they were maybe more helpful for those customers who had really fallen behind. The average repayment plan was probably about 6 months long, which is what is required under the IURC orders and the executive orders. Some of them went up to maybe 12 months long. Some of them actually didn't really need to make a lot of changes to what they had already been doing pre-pandemic. So maybe they already had some good payment plans and customer communications in place to try to tackle customers that weren't paying their bills, and maybe they didn't really have to even do a lot at all to comply with the orders and to make sure that their customers were able to get their bills paid. Like I mentioned, the people that I talked to seemed to think that it had been going pretty well. There were a minimal number of disconnections resulting from COVID, and then people not being able to pay their bills or at least get entered onto a repayment plan to try to address that. Customers seem to be pretty receptive to communications from the utility about when the disconnect moratorium would end, what their options were to get on a payment plan, and all of that. They were appreciative of the communication. Some people were able to get caught up, their balance caught up to current without needing to enter into a repayment plan. And then still, again, some utilities, they already had those mechanisms in place pre-pandemic and were able to sort of just go with what they had always been doing as far as getting people who were behind on a payment plan, eventually when they get to that point, disconnecting them if necessary, and then going through kind of their normal collections process. And so, and some utilities seem to be kind of less affected by this than others. I also looked at some kind of example or model payment plans that were, kind of around the Midwest, and what some utilities, not necessarily telecom utilities, were doing. And one that I found that I thought was interesting and something to maybe look at actually is a model plan that had been offered for municipal utilities, but certainly could be adapted for any kind of utility. And that one was sort of where you would have a waiver of a percentage of your accrued penalties that would be based on the length of the payment plan that you choose as a customer. And so, for example, if you choose the shortest repayment plan, maybe 3 months, all of your penalties that you had accrued, late fees and that kind of thing, would be waived. But the longer your repayment plan that you chose to enter into, the fewer of your penalties that would be waived. And ultimately, if you entered into the longest repayment plan, like 12 months or so, you would end up paying all of your penalties over time. In that plan, the customers, if they kind of failed to meet, if they entered into a shorter repayment plan and they failed to make payments when they were supposed to and meet the obligations of that repayment plan, then they would kind of automatically be moved up to the next longest repayment plan, which would include the payment of additional penalties. And that would kind of keep going until they got to the longest repayment plan of about 12 months. And then if they defaulted on that, then they would just be placed on the disconnect list, and normal proceedings would follow as far as disconnection and collections and things like that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting model for consideration. Other utility payment plans in the Midwest have required maybe an upfront payment of a portion of it in order to even be able to enter into the repayment plan. So that is also a consideration. They can really be kind of crafted, you know, in the way that would be the most beneficial to the customer and utility, and be most likely to encourage the customer and incentivize them to actually get caught up on their bills. I'll talk briefly, I know I'm about out of time, but I just wanted to mention some other best practices that have been suggested. In that IURC case that I was talking about earlier, the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor has actually filed some recommendations for utilities to basically plainly display all the information about the, you know, disconnections and payment plans and all of that on all disconnect notices and all customer billing communications. The OUCC has also suggested offering 12 to 18 month deferred payment plans for low income customers. And as a telecom utility, some of you might have some of this information to determine who is a low income customer. If you are offering lifeline services, for example, and you might already kind of have an idea of who might qualify if you were to offer a longer repayment plan for certain customers. Otherwise, you could allow self-certification of people who are affected by COVID, maybe negatively financially, to allow them to qualify for a longer repayment plan. The OUCC finally suggested that utilities suspend or continue suspension of credit reporting and collection activities. Again, this is a suggestion, it's not required in any order. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about customer communications again, because I already kind of touched on it a little bit before. But some of the things that different utilities around Indiana are doing are kind of directly emailing, texting, calling their customers, like I mentioned before, really targeting the customers that they really need to get them up to date on their bills to avoid disconnection, making sure all the information is on like a dedicated web page as part of their website that is linked to the homepage of the website so that it's very clear where to find the information that you would need to make sure that you are paid up in full, and just generally using regular customer communications in a way to let people really know what's going on as far as COVID and the different consumer protections that are in place. Also, it's been suggested maybe that utilities try to coordinate with certain customer assistance programs, like in Indiana, there's Indiana 211, that just as an example, that help residential customers, so that residential customers kind of know what programs and things are available when they do get assistance to pay their utility bills. And then finally, with respect to best practices, as always, probably not even necessarily just in the time of COVID, offering easy digital payment methods is a good way to get people to pay. I just wanted to mention that briefly, that we do not know if there will be any federal relief on the way for this. As of right now, there is no federal stimulus that appears to be concretely taking shape. And if it does, we don't know what exactly would be in it. There have been some suggestions about what could be included in it as far as helping with broadband, maybe some funds similar to a lifeline type program that would allow low-income households and newly unemployed people due to COVID to be able to pay a portion of their broadband charges every month. That could be a program that would allow maybe up to a certain dollar amount of funding assistance. Could be something that the broadband provider would actually participate in and receive the federal funding, sort of like Lifeline. There's been suggestions that maybe in order to do something like that, the broadband provider wouldn't have to go through all the hoops that they do now to get federal funding, like becoming an eligible telecommunications carrier, that kind of thing. There's been suggestions that maybe allowing providers to use E-rate federal funding to support students that are studying from home instead of just providing those services to schools only. And then, of course, always, even probably pre-pandemic, we're always looking at ways to fund broadband deployment. That has always been important, but maybe even now more so. And then I will just mention, I won't really describe it too much, but the FCC has waived some Lifeline rules as well in response to the pandemic to kind of help consumers be able to more easily qualify for Lifeline assistance. And so that has also been a way that the federal government has tried to kind of help people and providers during this pandemic. So with that, I'm out of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Otherwise, my contact information is there, if you can see my slides, and you are welcome to email me or call me at any time with any other questions. Thank you.